Look, every war is a bit of a gamble. But this one is more of a gamble than it appears on the surface. When the United States started to bomb Iran on February 28th, it may have been tempting to dismiss the operation as having a low downside risk. After all, only a generation ago, the United States began a pair of wars that would last a combined 28 years or so. They were incredibly expensive, so much so that it would have been literally impossible for a good chunk of the world's countries to conduct them without going bankrupt. And while they consumed a substantial portion of political bandwidth in Washington, it was very easy as an ordinary American to go about your everyday life and be completely oblivious to the fact that there were troops in Afghanistan or Iraq. By comparison, no one in Ukraine right now is under the false impression that it is business as usual there. So when you look at the situation in Iran, it seems like the downside risk should be even smaller than either of the Bush-era wars, and certainly nothing to the extent of Ukraine. The United States has a lot of metal mobilized to the Persian Gulf, sure, but there is no invasion force anywhere near the region, and the closest thing to potential boots on the ground may be a small special forces operation, perhaps similar to the one that removed Nicolas Maduro from Venezuela in January. Well, let me just quash that optimism now. There is a major downside risk here. Maybe not a catastrophic one like Ukraine, but still quite bad. And while I have heard the large media networks discuss the general problem, I do not think that they fully grasp the consequences of just how big of a gamble that the Trump administration is making if this war continues for a prolonged period of time and things don't go so well. Let's zoom out for a second. Since the Cold War ended, there has been no greater time to be a national security analyst than today. Equivalently, there has been no worse time to be an ordinary person. You knew that the conflict map was already a mess before this war started. Well, now you have Iran firing missiles and drones at basically every one of its Arab neighbors, the United Kingdom upset that one of its bases in Cyprus somehow came under fire, and soon active cooperation between Ukraine and members of the anti-Iran coalition. Gotta get those shaheeds under control. Now, I do not think that this is World War III, yet, but it is hard to shake the feeling that we are in the middle of a world war. Given that, we ought to understand where Iran ranks in terms of direct security threats to the United States. And this is my own personal ordering here, not what you may read in some strategic documents flowing out of the Pentagon. I am also thinking about long-term time horizons, not just what might happen tomorrow. At the top of the list, you have China. That should be a universal choice. Even NATO, the organization once singularly focused on stopping Moscow from expanding westward at all costs, now frames China as the Western coalition's pacing threat. China has global aspirations and the population and economy to accomplish it, even if the process may be bumpy. Plus, there is a potential cross-strait hotspot that we will return to in depth later. Then you have Russia, which, while is not much of a direct security threat to the United States, is very much a direct security threat to Europe. If Europe were to ever be hit with a major war, the United States would be pulled into it via Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. Aside from the costs of a military intervention, damage to the supply chains would be enough to send the United States into a major recession, if not worse. After that, maybe you could start putting Iran into a third tier of threat. The Islamic Republic runs against U.S. regional interests, but it would be hard for Iran to directly hurt the United States without suffering some sort of catastrophic retaliation. Even an Iran with nuclear weapons would struggle to break out of that mold. It might resemble North Korea, but with better ability to regionally project power. Still a concern, but not getting close to China or Russia levels. Given that, it might be reasonable to shift Iran down to a fourth tier, even below nebulous threats in the Western Hemisphere. At least those countries are close enough to the United States to cause a significant problem with cheap drones, should any of them go rogue. Notably, the main reason that the Western Hemisphere ranks higher on Pentagon documents is because of what China, and to a lesser extent Russia, might do to manipulate those Western Hemisphere nations. Back to today's focus. Iran falling down the tier list is a recent development. Millennials and older can all remember a time when the United States was obsessed over oil security. The Middle East had become the top priority for the United States, with Russia down, China not yet up, and energy the backbone of GDP growth. However, the shale revolution suddenly increased U.S. oil production. Combine that with some improvements to fuel efficiency, and the United States became a net oil exporter in 2020. The abundance of oil now means that unfriendly countries have a limited ability to coerce the United States via oil embargoes. Images of 1970s fuel crises are indeed a thing of the past. To be clear, the United States must still care about Middle East politics to some degree. Countries from the region continue to export incredible amounts of oil elsewhere. That keeps global oil prices low, and therefore makes U.S. consumers happy. It is just that oil is no longer the strategic vulnerability that it once was. Anyway, for the ongoing war, the point here is that the United States is exerting effort to eliminate a low-tier competitor. Consequently, for this to be a good idea, you had better be getting a lot of bang for your buck. So, is the United States getting a lot of bang for its buck? Well, let's start with the cost half of it, because it is easy to miss the deeper problem here. Trump ran on a policy to end the aforementioned forever wars of the previous generation. So far, he has succeeded if we are very careful to stick to that exact statement. You see, Trump has arguably had the most adventurous first 14 months of any U.S. president. There was the roughly 2-month-long series of airstrikes against the Houthis in Yemen. Then there was the one-shot strikes on Iran's nuclear program in the middle of the Israel-Iran 12-day war. In the new year, we had the Special Maduro operation. Sprinkled in between, there have been a handful of smaller-scale strikes and special forces missions. Adventurous? Yes. Involved in forever wars? Not so much. Trump's Pentagon has emphasized agility. If boots are going to touch the ground, they need to get off the ground as soon as possible. Nothing like 20 years in Afghanistan can happen. Heading back to the Houthis, Trump actually ended that engagement precisely because it was taking too long. As low of a tier of a threat as Iran is, the Houthis were even lower. They are an Iranian proxy group causing problems with international shipping, but otherwise not a major threat to U.S. interests. Any proxy group, almost by definition, must be on a lower tier than its patron. Correspondingly, the White House concluded that the operation had an alarming burn rate. Every missile exhausted along the Bab el-Mandab Strait was a missile that could not be exhausted later along the Taiwan Strait. For context, after the Cold War ended, the United States intentionally let its heavy metal stockpiles run lower because the Soviet threat was no longer around. Consuming a peace dividend was sensible. Where things really started to go wrong was with the Bush-era focus on fighting insurgencies. Heavy metal is pretty much the opposite of what you were looking for there. As a result, purchases plunged even further. And so the United States is currently in the position of having already low stockpiles, and is rapidly burning through them despite that. It is difficult to put a number on both the consumption and the reserves, because all of that information is classified. And for good reason, too. It would tell Iran exactly how much the country needs to withstand before the United States has to move along. But today, there are a ton of nervous people at the Pentagon, worried that the United States might find itself a few years from now wishing that it had those missiles to fire at China. And if you were not sure about that, then take a look at the White House on Friday. The prime defense contractors are meeting to discuss expanding traditional weapons stockpiles. Thus, part of the gamble here is timing. By all accounts, the PRC does not yet have sufficient landing craft to try to invade Taiwan. How much more time Beijing needs, though, is a subject of debate. In turn, you can conceive of the situation in Iran as the United States of today borrowing metal from its future self. Whether the loan will pay off depends on the return on the investment. So let's talk about that. And indeed, we need to pivot to the upshot for a success in Iran. Although Iran does contain some direct value, the only way that the investment can prove profitable is by affecting the top-tier threat. Thus, we immediately need to discuss China again. If the PRC were to ever invade Taiwan, the entire world would encounter an economic catastrophe, even if Beijing's forces fail to capture the island. Taiwan produces something around 90% of the world's top-of-the-line microchips and accounts for 60% of chip revenue worldwide. Almost every piece of reasonably sophisticated technology that you own has Taiwan's fingerprints on it. Both this video's production and your ability to watch it on your screen somehow connect back to the island. And Taiwan would never, ever allow those manufacturing centers to fall into enemy hands. It is not hard to sabotage the corresponding machines. They are extremely sensitive, and Taiwan would not hesitate to sabotage them when necessary. If you remember the supply chain issues from the pandemic, particularly with Detroit's inability to push new cars off the assembly line, the culprit was a shortage of microchips. Well, a PRC invasion of Taiwan would cause problems in order of magnitude worse. Without chips, every other component of, say, your phone becomes worthless. Anyone working in those corresponding industries is liable to lose their jobs too. After that, the service sector falls apart. We could spend an hour working through the domino effects, and even then we would only be scratching the surface. That is why deterring an invasion, not just winning the confrontation, but deterring it in the first place, is so important. Hence the immediate concern that any missiles used in Iran are missiles that cannot be used against the PRC. However, missiles are not the only deterrent. Oil is another key factor. Basically, all of the concerns that the United States had regarding oil security a few decades ago have shifted to the PRC. Beijing only produces 4 to 5 million barrels per day. It consumes 15 million barrels. If you ever wondered why the PRC has pushed so hard to expand its EV industry, this is why. Oil needs are not just sending money out of the country. It is also a national security issue. As it stands in peacetime, the PRC imports oil like the rest of us. On the official books, the leading exporters to the PRC include Russia, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Brazil. Unofficially, it is likely laundering Iranian oil through intermediaries. But that is not the critical national security question. Rather, the important thing is where the PRC would obtain its oil in the event of World War III. Because if the Western coalition controls the supply, it could starve Beijing into submission. And that, in turn, would deter Xi from trying in the first place. At the start of the year, we would have assumed that the PRC had 3 safe outlets: Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, the last of which does not make sense in peacetime due to geography, but would be worth the premium during a war if there were no alternatives. Russia is a sticky problem that will not go away, and you can see why Beijing has worked to maintain the status quo inside of the Kremlin. After January, though, Venezuela is no longer on that list. And depending on what happens in the upcoming days, weeks, or months, Iran may fall off of it too. I keep saying this, but it is worth repeating. For this part of the benefit of the Iran war, there need not be a clean transition to a cooperative government as we saw in Venezuela. A chaotic Iran that cannot export oil to anyone is a chaotic Iran that cannot specifically export oil to China either. Now, is that worth exhausting a substantial chunk of the U.S. weapons stockpiles? Unclear. And there is the downside risk that none of this works, the Islamic Republic of Iran persists under a new Ayatollah, and the United States faces the worst of both worlds. No weapons to deter Beijing, and no ability to control the oil flow from Iran. That is why the operation we are watching now is so high leverage. The worst-case scenario feeds a much deeper security problem, but the best-case scenario shores up the most pressing challenge that the Western coalition may face over the next decade. If you want to learn more about the potential for a long war along the Taiwan Strait, I have a feature-length video on the subject. It pairs well right now with my other feature-length video on the closing of the Strait of Hormuz. But for now, let's go straight to the end of this video. Indeed, if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.